Hello and welcome. My name is Nate from Video Games Recon. First off, if you've already seen this intro in a previous video, feel free to skip ahead to the time on screen. Otherwise, let me explain that this is one video of 3 in this series, within which I'm going to be bidding farewell to Destiny. As although I've had fun, I have decided to take a sabbatical from this game, potentially indefinitely, until serious changes are made to unleash what I feel is the true potential of this game and universe. For the reasons that will be discussed within these 3 videos, with the working titles, Why I'm Done with Destiny, Where Destiny Went Wrong for Me, a retrospective, What Destiny got right and what changes would get me playing again. The annotations on screen or links in the description will take you to said videos should you be interested. Now, as a caveat, I still may pop back into Destiny every now and again over the next few weeks, just to see what's going on, play the odd Crucible match, and of course, if they do any new missions like the Urn of Sacrifice bounty free within the DLC and similar. But otherwise, I will be trying to refrain from getting aboard the hype train surrounding the DLC rumoured to be known as the Taken King. Even though I know the temptation will be there this fall. But I'm intent on staying strong and not getting sucked in by all the marketing spiel this time. You know what they say, once bitten, twice shy. Anywho, I'm going to put my usual disclaimer out there that this is just my humble opinion, so please try not to lose your shit should you disagree. Instead, feel free to have a rational, I repeat rational, conversation with me and others in the comments section. Anywho, without any further ado, let's do it to it. Before we get into it, some of the topics discussed may be iterations on points previously discussed in other videos in this series, but I will try and give a different take on those points and keep them short. So, with all that, let's start at the very beginning, shall we? Like many people, when I first heard about this game, it sounded like a new epoch in gaming may well be round the corner, full with new and revolutionary ways of gaming within the genre of both first-person shooters and open-world games, blurring the lines between multiplayer, single-player, co-op, PvE and PvP, all wrapped in an interesting story and universe. And minus the revolution and story, we got that, to a degree. The blur between multiplayer and co-op is real, but honestly, completely unnecessary, as you have to ask yourself, what does this addition add to this game once the novelty of doing a public event or waving at some random out in the wild wears off? And trust me, it wears off quickly. When this is all something that could have easily been imitated with NPC guardians and a traditional co-op experience, and maybe with a single social area, that I would guess could be implemented like any traditional multiplayer social area, and would have saved millions of dollars and probably at least a year of development time, within which they could have, I don't know, maybe created an engaging and coherent story for starters? To play devil's advocate for a second, attempting something new is difficult, and it may just be a case that Destiny is ahead of its time and a prototype for that revolutionary blend of multiplayer and single player, as well as game genres in general. And perhaps it will take a game like The Division or a Destiny 2.0 to get it to a point where it makes sense and actually adds value to the game instead of just a novelty factor. And as for a blend of PvE and PvP, well, that's pretty much non-existent, as the only PvP element is a straight up old-fashioned Twitch shooter like a Call of Duty or Halo, instead of what many had hoped would be a PvP element, something more akin to a traditional MMO. Speaking of which, the early promotional material hinted towards a very different game, both in terms of story and game mechanics, and seemingly unintentionally towards being essentially an MMO shooter, which to be fair in retrospect would have probably been a better game. Anywho, so much so that they had to publicly release statements that it was unequivocally not an MMO, even though it did have some similar elements. And in combination with stability reasons, probably part of the reason they released such a large portion of the game in the alpha and beta, being stuck in between a rock and a hard place, as the perhaps misguided perception of their game was very different to the actual game itself. Now, personally, I don't subscribe to the notion, like some people, that we were sold a completely different game, as at least in gameplay terms and from the beta on. If, however, you went purely from the promotional material, or perhaps even the alpha, I'd say you have a fair point, as much can change and be different from an alpha onwards. But the argument is rendered null and void once the beta was released, as from this point on you know exactly what the game is going to be like, as once a beta is out, it essentially means the game is 90 to 95% done, and thus what you see is pretty much what you get. And may I say, this was probably the best and smoothest beta experience I'd ever played, which oddly shot themselves in the foot, as although it was great, it wasn't like a usual beta, only being a relatively small slice of the actual finished game, but instead was about a third of the entire game at launch, which seems completely nonsensical unless you factor in the need for stability stress tests and needing to show enough of the game so as people won't feel that Bungie misrepresented what Destiny was, which a lot of people still did. And in terms of story at least, they had a point. So, to simplify, the problem with Destiny's excellent beta is that once the game came out, I'd already played a third of it, and the rest of it only took me a day or two to complete. And then all we were left with was the suspect endgame, a weird light leveling system which is too reliant on RNGs, and to this day I'm not completely convinced works or makes a whole lot of sense. Other things that held this game back are the very beautiful but essentially barren landscapes, at least in terms of interaction and engagement, as aside from just shooting stuff in a sort of horde mode mentality, and the odd, albeit moderately interesting public events, which again involves simply shooting stuff. What should we do today, Dinklebot? I know, let's shoot some stuff. And shoot some stuff. And shoot some stuff. Hey, a fetch quest. Well, alright, let's mix it up a little. Now with that done, what should we do now? I know, let's go shoot some stuff. Unfortunately, there is no other way to interact with things in these environments. Some simple touches like NPC vendors on the worlds themselves, perhaps like bounty trackers, Xur, or the clans like Dead Orbit and so on. And on top of that, more hidden collectibles that offer tangible rewards instead of useless loot and irrelevant grimoire score. Also, something like the odd puzzle every now and then to help cleanse the palette would have been good. Next is the weak and lackluster DLC, and even though the House of Wolves was pretty decent and a lot better than the Dark Below, it still felt a little unsubstantial, especially if you're not a Crucible player. On top of which, if you don't have the DLC, it locks you out of some of the weekly activities. For example, if this week's Nightfall is from one of the DLC packs, it means that the Nightfall Strike and its loot is now inaccessible to you, which seems a little unfair for players who had that mode before the DLC dropped and paid good money for it within the original game, and are now being locked out of parts of said original game. Now on to what is a recurring theme within what is wrong with Destiny, and that is story, whatever the hell that is. It's been so long I'm not sure what one would even look like anymore, as what little of it there is seems so inconsequential and disjointed that it's hard to give a fuck about anyone or anything that's going on in this universe, which is a shame as the world has such potential. But in reality, the few things that interest me about the story at the moment could be written on the back of a postage stamp. And thus my incentive to play since completing the initial game for the first time hasn't had anything to do with the story or lack thereof, especially since that weak source ending. My motivation for playing a mission or a strike is now shoot shit and get loot, and that's about it. I couldn't give a solitary fuck about the story or narrative at this point. And that's not because I don't like stories in games, it's because this one is so shit and irrelevant. In fact, it's so shit I did a parody of the entire original story that you can check out here or in the description should you wish to. The funny thing about all of this is, you'd think it's because they don't care about story and the lore of this universe. But if you can actually be bothered to check out the Grimoire cards on Bungie.net, you'll see that this universe is chock-a-block with interesting folklore. So, as a non-legacy Halo player, this leaves me with the only conclusion that maybe Bungie doesn't know how to make a good story, even with the open goal that is this universe. I was under the assumption that the Halo franchise had good stories, but maybe not. And from an open goal to an own goal, hiding the Grimoire cards and the lore of this game away on Bungie.net was such a stupid move, which I can only assume was either due to a lack of development time or a short-sighted attempt to get people to sign up to their website, which is completely pointless as I've only ever checked out their website once or twice and absolutely no interest in returning, perhaps ever. And I'd wager that half of the people who bought this game never even visited their website once and never will, which is such a shame, as if you can be bothered, there's some interesting stuff in those Grimoire cards and could actually go some way to make me give a shit about what's going on in this world if they'd have only included it in the game somehow. But one of the biggest sins that really held this game back for me personally is being forced to find up to 5 players to be able to play a significant amount of the endgame activities, instead of it just being optional. Which would be okay if they had some sort of matchmaking or a social space that was actually, well, social, instead of just ships passing in the night. As the title of so-called social spaces is nothing but pure irony, as there's no socialising going on in these areas whatsoever. Instead, there should have been some sort of chat or text-based message board system so people could actually socialise and meet new people, so as to go on raids and strikes and whatnot together. That way, if you don't have enough friends online playing Destiny and that want to do the same things you want to do, you'd be able to find like-minded people, as opposed to being expected to find teammates yourself on Bungie.net or random online forums like it's the late 90s and early 2000s again. People defend this, saying it's not that difficult to find people to play the same activities and whatnot. That may well be the case, but it's still a step backwards into the past of gaming instead of forwards into the present, let alone the future. On top of which, it's just weird to have external barriers that are removed from the game itself and can restrict progression, especially for a game where collaboration is so vital in the endgame, instead of some sort of in-game clan or fire team meet and greet feature. Retrospectively speaking, where this game went off the rails for me, aside from the stuff previously discussed, is in terms of continuity, as this game is trying to be all things to all people, but unfortunately, like most things that attempt this, falls short and instead feels like a game with an identity crisis and isn't quite sure what it wants to be. Is it an MMO, an ARPG, PvP shooter, single player campaign, co-op PvE game, or perhaps an open world horde mode style game? It's probably all of those things and none, thus ends up being a jack of all trades and a master of none. On top of which, it is yet another casualty of hopping on board the hype train too early, as everybody had a perception of this game, rightly or wrongly, before the alpha and beta that was pretty far removed from the Destiny we actually got, which to be fair, wasn't helped by their early promotional material. So, that's my thoughts in retrospect as to where Bungie took some wrong turns with Destiny, and where they could learn from their mistakes and look to improve this franchise in the future. Again, please keep in mind this is just my humble opinion, and that it's okay for people not to agree on everything. Now, I can see this video may seem quite negative towards Destiny, but I'd just like to reiterate I don't hate Destiny. It would make no sense for someone who has dumped God knows how many hours into this game, probably hundreds. So it would be incredibly hypocritical to say I haven't enjoyed myself a lot of the time and that I didn't get my money's worth out of this game. So with that, on my last video we're going to end on a more positive note and discuss what Bungie got right and the things they could do to get me and a bunch of other like-minded players interested in the Destiny franchise again. This just leaves me to say if you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, share and subscribe for more BS of a similar nature. Thank you and goodbye.